Well, good evening, everybody. I suspect that we will not have as many people joining us at 5 as we've had joining us at 7, but it's something that I had to do because we're going to be doing some recording for Sunday this evening around 6:30. So it's just kind of how things will be unless we change it up yet again next week. I know it feels like maybe to some of you we've been all over the map as to where we would, live stream from, whether my Facebook page or Pulaski Street's Facebook page. I guess the YouTube channel's been the constant through all of this, but hey, we're just doing the best we can with what we've got and the times we're living in. I want to go ahead and get into the devotional or lesson for this evening. And we'll end as we do each Wednesday night with some announcements and prayer. But this is what I want us to think about this evening: serving the sufferer. A lot of folks these days are struggling, suffering for all kinds of reasons. We have the pandemic itself for those that contract the virus. And then we have, we have non-COVID related issues that are going in some cases unattended because of hospitals bracing themselves for whatever spike may occur. There's economic fallout that's causing a lot of suffering. Then there's the latest news, right, about this murder hornet. It's blowing my mind. I did see a picture on Facebook. Somebody said coming in June, and someone had kind of created this hybrid animal. If you find it, it's pretty funny looking, though kind of scary. But it looks like a seagull from the back, feathers and wings, and then the face is like a shark. I mean, I guess that'd be worse than a murder hornet, but and then all the storms and damage and inconveniences and frustrations. So in unprecedented times where there's just a lot of pain all around us, I want us to move from what we've been looking at the last few weeks, which is some of the good things that suffering provides if we respond to it appropriately. I want us to get, practical this evening and to think about how it is that we might serve those who are suffering, and to make sure that we're doing it in a profitable way. And really, when it comes to serving sufferers, if there's anybody that should be prepared to do that, it should be God's people, right? There's an interesting passage in Psalm 69:20. Here's David. And notice he's bemoaning the fact that he doesn't have any comforters. He says, "Reproaches have broken my heart so that I am in despair. I looked for pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none." He needed someone to come alongside of him. And unfortunately, he felt as if there was no one there for him. Those of us who are Christians shouldn't want anybody around us to feel this way. And but I think we would all admit that being around a person who is in pain, who is suffering, can, in one way or another, can be uncomfortable, can be difficult. And so we may shirk our comforting responsibilities. And even for those of us who do show up to provide some consolation in the life of a sufferer, we need to make sure that we don't make things worse, or that we prove to be ineffective or even exasperating. There is in Proverbs this passage, whoever sings songs to a heavy heart is like one who takes off a garment on a cold day, and like vinegar on soda. It's jarring. Maybe we could say revolting, or even sort of volatile. for us to respond inappropriately or against what would be accepted in a certain situation. And so I want us to get practical, and I want to just share with you some things to keep in mind when serving sufferers. Okay, so here's I got 4 of these. Here's the first one. Serve the sufferer with silence. We are often too quick to speak to those who are in the depths of suffering. We are uncomfortable with silence. Most of us are. Some of us aren't, but most of us are, and so we feel like we got to say something. Again, the Proverbs writer says, "Do you see a man who speaks in haste? There's more hope for a fool than for him." And I know that there's a general application of this, but there's a principle in this that stands true when you're dealing and serving someone who is who's suffering. A lengthy silence is better than a hasty sentence. I think that's some good colloquial wisdom right there. Silence can be awkward, and we don't feel like we are helping when we are silent. But comfort often comes more in the form of presence than words. And if you think about the context of a lost loved one, often people will report that they don't really remember a whole lot of what was said at the funeral, but they do remember the faces of those who were there. I think about Job's friends. If you go towards the end of the book of Job in Job 42, Job's 3 friends are rebuked by God on at least two verses in the span of, and this is in Job 42, 7 through 9. He says twice that you guys didn't speak of me what was right. And that becomes true of them, but we ought to keep in mind, or at least recall, that when things went south for Job, that what his 3 friends initially did was admirable. So here's Job 2, 11 through 13. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven, which was a common Near Eastern practice, ancient Near Eastern practice. And, verse 13, important, they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So there's a principle in there for us when it comes to serving those that are facing an especially difficult season of suffering, that silence can be good, can be very good. Here's another way in which we can serve sufferers, and that's with sympathy. And this kind of ties into the first part and what we say when we do choose to say something. And here's a little thing that I wrote that I think is true. The context of suffering is no place for pithy platitudes, cliche comments, and then here you go, theological tweets and tweaks. And the latter part of this statement's probably a little different, but I can't explain. Refrain from saying things like, "This was the will of God." To me, that's kind of like a theological tweet. It's just this something that gets said a whole lot, but that in most cases is impossible for the person who's saying it to know that for certain. And then sometimes it's said in very inappropriate situations or circumstances. Some will say it was for the best. And that, depending on the circumstance, that may not come across all that well. Or you need to take a hard look at your life. God is trying to get your attention. As we'll see, that's kind of where Job's friends went when they decided to open their mouth. You'll get over this, or it's only temporary. When a person is in the throes of suffering, it is not the time for interpreting what has happened or trying to correct or tweak a person's theological interpretation of the situation that has caused the suffering. So many times when you're ministering to someone who is battling grief or loss of something or someone, they're often searching for meaning, right? Why? They won't answer the question why. And in time, people will come up with a reason that provides them with some comfort, or that helps them that day to get to the next day. The last thing they need you doing is deconstructing what they're saying. Let them have it. You got to be there. We should suffer with our friends rather than attempting to, in that moment, restructure their view of God or their view of life. Job's friends, of course, made the mistake of correcting Job or trying to prove to him what was happening to him, and that he was this big sinner who deserved all the suffering that he was having to endure. And they'd been talking this way for several chapters, and then this is what Job has to say. He says, "I have heard many such things," and it's true. By that time, he had heard many such things along those lines. And then he says, "Miserable comforters are you all." I didn't share his suffering. They thought they could explain it. But all Job wanted was people with whom he could share his burdens and his grief. We must be willing to sit with sufferers and give them permission to speak to God in deep lament about their doubts and their fears and their anger, their dismay, and the questions that those laments contain. Too often, right, we divert to mundane topics because we're uncomfortable listening to their laments and groans. God listens to our laments. The book of Psalms proves that. He listens to our laments, and we should listen to each other's laments. It is not the comforter's task to lead the discussion, but to be a sympathetic listener, right? We must be willing to listen even when our pain is increased by what we hear. When the sufferer laments, do not rebuke or chastise. Listen attentively and actively. Give them free rein in verbalizing their pain and sorrow, and respond with expressions of sympathy. I cannot imagine what you're going through. It's terrible. I'm so sorry. Here's a third thing. Serve the sufferer with service. And this is about being watchful and alert, available, practical. The point here is essentially what John was getting at in 1 John 3:16 through 18. I'll blow this up so you can see it. Here's what he said here. And again, a general context, but it has meaning for what we're talking about. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. And he here, of course, is Jesus. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods, and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. So, food needs to be prepared. When suffering descends on a household or an individual, their life freezes in time in a way. It's hard for them to think. It's hard for them to do. And so food might need to be prepared. Groceries will need to be purchased. Dishes will need to be washed. Laundry will need to be folded. The yard will need to be mowed. Children may need a babysitter. Bills will need to be paid. It's okay. It's okay to ask what needs to be done. That's good. It might even be better to say, hey, I see that this needs to be done, and I'm going to do something about it. I'm not just going to say that I will. I'm actually going to follow through. And so we can serve the sufferer with service, helping them out in a variety of ways that allows them to mourn and to grieve and to process their pain. And then here's one last thing, and potentially one of the most important things that we can do for the sufferers in our lives. It's interesting, the connection here. We should serve the sufferer with supplication. In James chapter 5 and verse 13, he says, is anyone among you suffering? Well, let him pray. The second part of this verse says, is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praises. I can't help but think of where we started in that passage in Proverbs. If someone is suffering, it's probably not best to sing to their face or sing praises. And this is even saying here that if you're the one who's suffering, if you're in the midst of suffering, pray. But we can go beyond this passage and think of all the intercessory prayers that Paul would pray on behalf of the churches and various individuals. And he calls us to intercessory prayer on behalf of our brothers and sisters and even those beyond our church family, that we will go to the throne of God where we can get help for ourselves and, of course, for others. Comforters should cry out to God on the sufferer's behalf. Comforters should petition God to stoop down and lift up the sufferer. I mean, after all, God is the master at turning tragedy into triumph. So there's 4 things. Practical, serving the sufferer. They're going to need probably your silence. They're going to need your sympathy. They're going to need your service. And they're going to need your supplication. They're going to need your prayers. In line with praying, I want to kind of transition here to think about some of those that are hurting in our church family. We want to pray for the family of Clarence Walker Osborne. This was the uncle of Tim Clifton. He passed away just a little less than a week ago, and they had the funeral for him this past Sunday. So keep Tim in your prayers during this time. Also, here's just a few I want to give some updates on outside of an email I sent earlier. Of course, we continue to think about the impact that this pandemic is making in the lives of so many people. But here on a local level, there's Melanie, our beloved church secretary, who, she's the absolute best in my opinion. And we miss her here. We've missed her the last 3 days. We're fortunate that Sandy Adams was willing to come in at least in the mornings, the better part of the day on Monday, and to kind of fill in and take some phone calls and keep some notes to help Melanie out when she gets back. But Melanie's at home and trying to recover. but you guys understand that sometimes the cure can be just as difficult as the problem. And so she's had some side effects from the medicine she's taken that are not fun, and we want to, headache, and so just keep her in your prayers. She continues to move forward here. We've mentioned Kevin Jones. This is Rebecca Mealy's son-in-law, married Jasmine. He is he's at home recovering. He had the surgery. They had to put 3 anchors in his back, the labrum area. I'm told that 5 anchors is pretty much the worst, so 3's not as bad as that, but I don't know of anybody that would want to have had this surgery, and now he's in the process of recovering. So then you continue to remember him. We've got here Scott and Jeffrey. Scott, for those that are not a part of the church family, they're not kin to one another, but Scott is he is in a prison, Trousdale Turner Correctional Center, and they've had a major outbreak of COVID-19. He is among those that have tested positive, but I believe he remains asymptomatic. And his mama, Miss Dean, has been kind of shaking the trees here so that she could speak to her son, or at least hear from him to see how he's doing. And so she is feeling a little bit better with some information she's been given, but just keep him in that situation in your prayers. Jeffrey, my understanding, he is incarcerated over at Bledsoe County, and they have lifted the lockdown. He'll have a chance to make some calls to some folks here and there, but that continues to be a touch-and-go situation. And then lastly, we mentioned Frances Russ. Frances is the mother of Carol Wiseman, and she has been in the ICU here locally at STRHS, just moved into a regular room today. Is going to be facing some rehabilitation. She's been in the hospital for pneumonia, but she's making some good progress, going in the right direction, for which Carol is thankful, but prayers are still needed in her behalf. So let's take just a little time here to pray for these folks, and then I'll be signing off here. And you may have some folks in your family or in the church family that you stay connected to. Encourage them to watch this later if they weren't able to do it during this time. But let's go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, we are so grateful for the hope you give us, for the anchor that you provide for our lives when things get difficult without. We pray for your compassion and your mercy on all of those that we have mentioned this evening who are struggling or suffering in one way or another. We know that as dire and as bleak as things can look, and we know that the news at times seems to get worse with each passing day. But we're thankful that there is a good news that is far brighter, will always be far brighter than the worst news that this world could offer us. And we know that's possible because of your Son and what he did for us that we could not do for ourselves. And so we thank you for him. And it is in his name that we pray this prayer. Amen.